Hi there, and welcome to week 7. It's another one of my favorite sessions of our time together. As I've told you before, my degree is in American Studies. What American Studies does as an interdisciplinary program is it looks at America from all kinds of angles. You can study American history, American literature, urban planning, politics, you name it, as long as it's focused on America. One of the questions that we American Studies scholars continually ask is, what does it mean to be an American? What makes an American unique and different? And what really defines the essence of American culture? The answer to that question is often posed in terms of the American West. To have a huge expanse of land that is relatively unoccupied and not formally controlled or directly governed by a nation state for the first couple of hundred years of your history is an incredibly unique situation in modern history. Now, I recognize that the land was not unoccupied and that there were nations, both native and, in the case of much of the West, Spain and Mexico, that owned the land, that viewed it as theirs. And yet, there was no formal political structures with either native governments or the Spanish or Mexicans that really resemble modern governments. So this concept for the first several hundred years of our existence in the U.S. was that there's this great expanse of land which we could grow and solve problems with. And this whole idea is one of the defining things about what it means to be an American. Modern day Western historians define 7 characteristics of the West that they say really encapsulates what it means to have this great American Western land. And so we're going to look at those briefly. Number 1, the West is an important meeting ground. It's a place where Native American, African American, Latin American, Anglo American, Asian Americans, these all intersect. Because of this, there are more ethnic challenges than in the East. There are more diverse languages, religions, cultures. Of course, you see that kind of diversity in cities across America, but in the West, you see this play out in really different kinds of ways, with large groups of very diverse ethnicities and cultures. Number 2, these diverse groups all have their own rightful ownership to the land. They have their own claim to this common ground. So when you think about the idea of conquest, of conquering the West, it's really about drawing lines on a map, deciding who owns what, and the change of philosophy from land as a shared substance to actually owned and defined property. So historians often define Western history as a competition for legitimacy. Which culture gets the right to claim for itself the status of legitimate ownership of the West? So the West becomes this intersection of ethnic diversity with the struggle for property allocation. That's number 2. Number 3, related to all of that above, is the contest for cultural dominance. What language is going to prevail? What culture and religion is going to come out on top? How do these cultures, languages, religions get recognized as legitimate? So think about ongoing conversations about the use of Spanish in much of the American Southwest, where in some cases, whole areas as large as even whole states are, the majority are Spanish speaking, and yet they don't have that recognized legitimacy because it's not the official language. So there's issues of bilingualism, there's issues of immigration, and how do natives assimilate into American culture? All of these things are questions of this context for cultural legitimacy or cultural dominance. Number 4 is the role of the federal government in the economy and the issues of dependence on the government as well as resentment to it. The government plays a role in the West unlike anywhere else in the U.S. The government owns more property in the West than anywhere else. It has more laws that affect things like ranching and farming and water rights and mining and economic systems in ways that don't really happen in the East. In the East, most of that's handled by states. But in the West, most of the land was owned and a part of the federal government prior to actually being a part of a state. To think about the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and much of the West, so places like Colorado, South Dakota, those areas, Colorado becomes a state in 1876. So the federal government has owned it for 73 years before it actually gets organized as a state. So the federal government just has a different relationship with it. Um, and that relationship's not always a positive one. Sometimes there's a lot of stress between the people and the government. Number 5 is cycles of recession and prosperity, what we would call boom and bust. Now, all of our country's economy is affected by cycles. Certainly, you think about something like the Great Depression. But what we see is that that's more predominant in the West, partly because the West is so dependent on environmental climate changes. It's also very dependent on things like the price of ore from mining towns. Think about the idea of Western ghost towns. I don't know if you've had a chance to go to any of those, but they're just incredible. Deadwood, South Dakota, and Dodge City, Kansas, which were part of the cattle boom era. There's also mining towns that spring up, and then people just evacuate when the gold or silver or copper dries up. And so this is an example of boom and bust, which is number 5. Number 6 is the idea of the encounter of innocence with complexity. The idea of extreme cases of high expectation meeting a very frustrating reality. The best example of this, of course, is the gold rush. People from all over the world rush into California in order to strike it rich, right? They're going to get rich overnight in this too good to be true kind of way. And for most of them, it was too good to be true, but they failed. A handful are successful, but really very few. So that's one example, but there are others. Also think about pioneers heading out west. The Oregon Trail, if you played that game as a child. If not, look it up. It's kind of fun. The point of the game is that you're on a wagon trail taking your family to Oregon because it's beautiful and there's land there and the weather is wonderful, and so you can have a great family farm. It's a very beautiful vision of what to expect once you get to Oregon. But what nobody bothers to tell you is how hard it's going to be to get there. You have to be in a wagon train for weeks, and you have to try to keep your family from dying of dysentery or being attacked by natives or hundreds of other ways that you might die along the way or deeply suffer along the way. So it's a good picture of this idealistic vision of moving west that are met, in most cases, by downright failure and great frustration. Number 7 is all about the environment and conquering the environment. If I asked you to think about the Western environment in your mind, what geography would you picture? I'd love to hear your answer to that because people have certain visions. Certainly, one of the things that come up is what we call the high desert, the Badlands of Wyoming and South Dakota, or Death Valley in California. These are the great desert areas of the Southwest of Arizona and New Mexico. Big cactuses, sandy plateaus, natives hiding all over the place, at least according to the Hollywood portrayal. So that's one vision of the West. Also think about the Rocky Mountains. While they're beautiful and a great place to escape for vacations, I'm not quite sure you'd want to have to survive there before the modern era. They're rugged and challenging, and people died by the hundreds trying to get across them before modern conveniences made that more possible. I had the chance to be in Wyoming and South Dakota a year ago and visiting Yellowstone and Mount Rushmore in those areas. And I was just struck by the fact that you can still drive for hundreds of miles without even seeing a gas station. They are very sparsely populated places. The reason for that is it's still not really a great place to live. It's really challenging to try to dig a life out there. So the idea of conquering the environment is still a great issue in the West. So those are 7 characteristics that historians use to describe the West. I wish we had more time to go into those and kind of how those affect American identity. But let's hit the high points here of how the U.S. moves west. First of all, I want to remind you where the West is. If you think back to the 1700s, the West really is Western New York and Pennsylvania, and then eventually Ohio, the Ohio region, and the Great Lakes. Daniel Boone explores into Kentucky and Tennessee. People eventually get to the Mississippi River and a little past that into Texas, and then they keep going through Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado, and into California. That's the image that we have, but that's really not what happens. What happens is the first part of that is true, to just about the Mississippi River. So in the 1700s, begin moving from Western New York and Pennsylvania into Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Ohio region, and then onto the Mississippi River, and a little bit past that into Texas and Missouri and around there. But then people skip over all the way to California for 2 reasons. The first of that's the gold rush, which took so many people to the West Coast. The second reason is what we just described about the environment. The Great Plains and the desert areas of the Rocky Mountains are really hard to live in. So it was just about getting through there as quickly as you could. Um, so when you think about population movements, yes, there is a line of population that is moving from east to west. But as you go into the late 1800s, there's also a line of population that's moving from the west to east. They will eventually meet in the middle, but this progression westward is not simple and smooth as a line of progression from east to west. When you start talking about the history of West, you have to start with Thomas Jefferson, of course. He was the one who first really celebrated the idea of the West, that great unoccupied piece of land that would shape American identity. He called that an empire of liberty. We discussed that a few weeks ago. Of course, he also adds the biggest piece to the West with the Louisiana Purchase. We've talked about that as politically questionable, and yet Jefferson still makes it happen. He then immediately sends out Lewis and Clark to explore. I'm quoting from Jefferson here as he wrote to Lewis and Clark. He says, "The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and any streams of it, and by its course in communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, may offer the most direct and practical route across the continent." So they're trying to figure out how to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific by water. And he also says to him, "Those who come after us will fill up the canvas we begin." So notice already in the early 1800s, Jefferson is envisioning that land out west as a place for Americans to settle and own. So in 1804, Lewis and Clark take off, accompanied by Sacagawea, a Shoshone native, who was their guide for most of the trip. They do make it to Oregon. They spend the winter with the Nez Perce Indians and return to St. Louis in 1806. Takes them about 2.5 years. So as we move into the 1830s and 40s, the spirit of America begins to change, as we've talked about. There's a great spirit of American optimism. Things are good. The experiment of our new Constitution seems to be working well, at least for a few more years. The economy's good. We're developing a national identity through things like literature and newspapers and other forms of unique culture. We've secured our independence from Britain, first through the Revolution and then the War of 1812. And so we're really coming into our own as a country. And with that is this spirit of optimism, and the West is a big part of that. A New York newspaperman uses the phrase manifest destiny to describe this. He says it is our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted it by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Manifest means obvious, and destiny means fate. So it is our obvious fate to spread throughout this land. That does take some time to generate political action, but the spirit is here by the early 1800s. After the Louisiana Purchase, the next big acquisition, of course, is Texas. I'm assuming you know the story of Texas. If not, get yourself down to the Alamo or San Jacinto and refresh your memory on how Texas becomes first an independent country and then part of the Union. The annexation of Texas does lead us to the Mexican War. What happens there is that when Texas is annexed into the U.S. in 1846, Mexico still had not recognized Texas's independence, even though it's been 10 years. Mexico is frustrated by the annexation, naturally so. In the midst of all this, even when Texas was a republic, there was dispute over the southern boundary of Texas. The Texans had always claimed the Rio Grande, where it is today, but the Mexicans had claimed the Nueces River, which is about 130 miles north of the Rio Grande. The United States Congress actually sided with the Mexican government, believing that the border should be at the Nueces. But Zachary Taylor, who's future president but currently a general, was sent to protect the border after Texas was annexed to the U.S., and he chooses to protect that border at the Rio Grande. So on April 25th, 1846, Mexican forces clashed with Taylor's forces just north of the Rio Grande. Taylor sends a message back to President James K. Polk telling him what happened, and Polk sends a war message to Congress on May 11th stating that, quote, Mexico has passed the boundaries of the U.S., has invaded our territory, and has shed American blood on American soil, end quote. The fascinating instance of rhetoric there, much like the Boston Massacre, this becomes a rallying cry, American blood on American soil. But is it a true statement? That's questionable. Certainly, it depends on who you might have asked. The result of it is that the war begins. The U.S. does win this war pretty easily. They arrive in Mexico City as the conquering army in 1847. They negotiate for a while until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the war in February of 1848. The U.S. then pays Mexico $15 million for the land it was going to take, which included Texas above the Rio Grande and New Mexico and California, and much of what is today the rest of the 48 states. What's surprising about this is that when a country wins a war, they don't pay the loser. That rarely happens. The losers pay, not the winners, right? But in this case, the US feels morally or ethically bound to say that we are not taking this land because we conquered it, we are taking it because we bought it. Now, Mexico doesn't really have an option in that, but it is a fascinating thing to think about and about the legitimacy of the US taking the land and why they must have felt necessary to purchase it. Nevertheless, that's what happens. The last major piece of the US is the Oregon Territory and what happens up there. The British had settled Oregon, and there was a time when it seemed we might be going back to war with Britain for the third time. But over time, peace negotiations went out, and we agreed to divide the Oregon Territory at what is today the boundary between Washington State and British Columbia, Canada. One final section of land is acquired in the 1850s called the Gadsden Purchase, in which the U.S. buys a small strip of land from Mexico in what is today southern New Mexico because we needed that land for a railroad route. But that rounds out the continental U.S. as we know it today. Of course, none of this comes without complications. The biggest of those has to do with what is coming to brew back in the political systems that's going to lead to a split over slavery. As we took over these new lands and they started the process of becoming states, there was a great question whether they would be slave states or free states and how that would affect the balance of the political system. So this leads to a lot of political challenges, and it leads to outright bloodshed in places like Kansas and Nebraska, and that will lead us straight to the Civil War. Stay tuned for next time when we will cover the Civil War and Reconstruction, and that will bring us to the end of our course. Have a great week.